All right, good morning, everyone. Yep, I'm Matt Ebb. In my day job, I'm an Effects Supervisor at Industrial Light and Magic in Sydney. But this is something that was done completely independently of them and doesn't have anything to do with them. Yeah, so about a year ago, Fiona from SideFX here sent me an email saying like, hey, you interested in doing a little project? We're working on this build of Houdini for the Mac Silicon CPUs, and we want someone to test it doing like a proper project. And I'm like, okay, that sounds pretty interesting. Like, what do you want me to do specifically? And she's like, you know, maybe use Karma or something, no real requirements. And I was like, you shouldn't have said something like that. But yeah, so this what I'm about to present to you is kind of the results of that. I kind of treated it as a little artistic project of my own where I could sort of let loose and experiment a little bit. So I don't know if anyone's going to get any sort of production useful tips out of this because it's a bit esoteric, but maybe just watching the thought process and that sort of thing will be interesting and useful to you. So yeah, it's using the idea of four-dimensional geometry and transforming geometry through 4 dimensions, but I'll play it first and I'll explain what it's all about. So here we go. So yeah, this was originally meant to be a 3 weeks worth of work, and it kind of ended up getting in deep and losing my mind, and took about 6 months in the end, fitting it in after hours and whatever free time I could. I got a little bit carried away, but that's because it was a really interesting thing to work through. So as part of this, I did also want to test various aspects of Houdini on this silicon. SideFX were able to provide me with a top-of-the-line Mac Studio Ultra, which is what I used to do all of this one. So 128 gigs of RAM, 20 cores, very, very powerful. And it was, yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that experience at the end, but first I wanted to talk about the project itself. Okay, yeah, so these sorts of ideas have been sort of rattling around in my head for a long time. In 2014, I was over at DNEG in London, and a friend of mine was over there with me too, a friend and colleague, Raphael Gadot, and he was working on the sequence of Interstellar where it's the tesseract collapse, where they're in this room and it all sort of folds in on itself. And he was explaining to me the sort of concepts and maths that he was using at the time to do this sort of 4D transformations, and it sounded really interesting. Fast forward a few years, I was at Animal Logic, and we were doing a little bit of early concept dev for what was going to become Wrinkle in Time, and there was an effect which was supposed to be a teleportation where this character can manipulate space and time. And so I was thinking, this 4D space and time, something with that. In the end, it went away, did something else, but still kept on thinking about that. So yeah, when this came up, I started going back over those old ideas and thinking, when I do things that's outside of my day job, I like to do things that are interesting and unusual and sort of pushes things a bit so that I can try something new that I haven't done before and don't know what to do. So and I guess the other thing was that it seems like there was a lot of potential interesting visual things that could come out of it too, things that I haven't done or seen before as well too. So yes. I'm going to have a little talk through here to sort of explain the ideas behind it and how it all works, and then break down some of the actual bits in the video a bit more. So, 4-dimensional. Okay, so you can start off with a single point. That's a 0-dimensional shape, and then you can go to a line, and that has 1 dimension up and down, and you can extrude that into a 2-dimensional surface, and then into a 3-dimensional cube. And then in all of these examples that we're used to in sort of normal life, each dimension is perpendicular to each other, and shapes from a sort of lower dimensional space can still live in a higher dimensional space. Like here we're looking at this sort of fake 3D view, but you can still have lines and points and stuff. They can still go side by side. And then, yes, what we have, it's in the wrong thing. Yeah, so this is like a bit of an example of a 4-dimensional shape, which is like a cube that's been extruded. So each of the faces of the cubes have new cubes on them, and they all have, to represent 4 dimensions, instead of just X, Y, and Z, you use X, Y, and Z, and W. It doesn't matter what it's called, it's just another number, and it doesn't really, in all of this, because we're not used to living in a 4-dimensional world, you have to sort of like turn your intuitive part of your brain off, because none of it makes sense. And it's just thinking of numbers. It's like 4 numbers instead of 3 numbers. So, how can we see a 4-dimensional object in 3 dimensions? Well, the usual thing that they do, which you probably see, like the interstellar stuff, is called projecting it into a lower dimensional space. And that's literally what's happening right here on this screen, is that we're looking at something that's supposed to be 3-dimensional inside Houdini, and it's projecting it onto the screen. That's all happening in the GPU. But yeah, it's flattening all of that geometry straight at you. So here's a little example of, I've got here's a shape, and I've got a line, and if I project the shape down to the line, then that's what I get. It's just on that line. Same thing here. You've all sort of seen it before, like a race op. Here's my sort of 3D object, and I'm projecting it into this 2D surface here. And there's a few interesting things about that, like we can see that in 3-dimensional space, all of my angles are perpendicular to each other, but when it gets projected into 2-dimensional space, those angles are not the same, and it gets all squished, and things which should be like nice squares, they get turned into like trapezoidal things, and so things change shape when they get projected, even though the original thing looks different. So the math for doing projection is pretty simple. It's like divide by the last component, blah, blah, blah. It's not that complicated. And here's an example of what happens if you project a 4D shape into 3D. So this is the sort of standard example of a tesseract, which is a 4-dimensional cube kind of thing. And this is the sort of thing that they were doing in Interstellar, with it sort of like folding around on itself. And this is the 4D cube going through rotation and projecting that into 3D space. So like before, even though these are still cubes and they're still perpendicular to each other and rigid and everything, by the time it gets projected, it gets sort of squished down and turned into a weird kind of shape like this. Okay. So that's all cool, but it's a bit hard to do complex shapes if you're projecting it down, because when you're projecting something, just like we saw with the our cube over here, we're seeing everything getting sort of squished together, and you're seeing the entire piece of geometry all there in the one plane. Another thing that you can do to try and reduce the dimensionality of an object is you can take a slice of it. So here's an example here. I'm just using boring Houdini tools of like knife, and I've got this cube, and if I sort of slide it up and down, you can see I'm slicing it through this 2D plane that's at the origin there. So as I move it up and down, that shape will change. So I'm taking it from a 3D shape, I'm reducing it down to 2D by taking a slice. So this is using some Houdini tools to do it. I previously started thinking about this by like, okay, well, well, I'd made other tools that do something similar before. We're taking a slice of geometry. And so how can you do that? Well, what I did here, and the same sort of thing in Vex, I'll describe it here first, which is if you've got this attribute that you're trying to slice it, say at the 0 point. So this might be the y-axis. I'm trying to slice it at y equals 0. So I can go over all of these edges and say, for the 2 points on the edge, is this point greater than 0 and is this point less than 0? And if it is, then I know it crosses 0 at some point and I can build a new edge points connecting all of those together. So just scanning it over each of these faces and connecting them up wherever it crosses 0. So this is the sort of thing that I've done before, making like iso contour lines on a mesh. You can do it with Houdini tools, but you can also do it yourself like that with a little bit of X. So then the next thing is, okay, here's where I go through my little rant here. Yes. So when we are working in 3D in something like Houdini or in Maya or whatever, we're usually using polygons, and those polygons get turned into triangles and sent to the graphics card. And the reason for that is that you can sort of break down any complex surface down into triangles. It's really easy to rasterize on the graphics card. Like since long and long ago, it made things quick and simple and easy. But it's actually what you're dealing with is a surface wrapped around something. It's like a paper mache thing or like a lantern sculpture. It's not solid geometry. And there is this sort of parallel history of computer graphics evolution called like CSG, constructive solid geometry. And that's used in some things like, engineering where it needs to be really precise. And that's when you're dealing with actual solids, like you'll have a solid cube and you Boolean it with a solid sphere and it makes a certain thing. And now there's actually like some tools popping up. I saw one by a Japanese guy called Magica CSG, which is like a really nice way of modeling, putting things together using solids, but it's really only now because graphics cards are fast enough that you can just ray trace it all on the GPU. Anyway, so in 3D, we're working with triangles because it's the simplest possible version that you can make a surface out of. So I was thinking, okay, well, what do we do in 4D? And I thought the simplest possible 4D shape is a tetrahedron. And luckily inside Houdini, we have a tetrahedron primitive. So, okay, this might go somewhere. So looking at this is a tetrahedron, by the way, if you didn't know what it was. It's just 4 triangles all connected together. The simplest possible kind of like volume, solid shape. So when you create it like this inside Houdini, this is still polygons, but then you can actually make it the proper tetrahedron. So you can see now it just has one tetrahedron. So it's like a type of data that has solid and volume, and you can find out where you are inside the tetrahedron. It's not just a surface. So I was thinking, okay, if I can figure out a way to slice a tetrahedron, then maybe I can build a 4-dimensional shape out of tetrahedrons and slice that, and I'll be able to turn a 4-dimensional shape into 3 dimensions. Okay, so basically did exactly the same thing. I've got it wrapped up into this little OTL here, where I just go over each edge of the tetrahedron, see if it crosses 0. In this case, I'm not using Y, I'm using W, because that's our 4-dimensional coordinate. And wherever it crosses W, I connect all that up together and I make a polygon out of it, and that's how I can slice a tetrahedron. And you can see it works as we go up and down like that. So with this, I was thinking, okay, now I can take a shape that's made out of polygons. I can extrude it into a 4-dimensional shape. I can just give it a W coordinate. And then after I've got that, I can fart around with it and make something that's really interesting by the time it gets sliced back into 3 dimensions. So I made a little OTL that extrudes things in different ways. So like coming from this grid here, I can extrude it into a 4-dimensional thing, which is now made out of tetrahedrons. And I've just got like a W coordinate 0 at this part, W coordinate 1 up here. I'm also extruding it in 3D space just so I can see what's going on, but it doesn't need to be. It could be completely flat in 3D, but it has extrusion in 4D because it's just got that W coordinate 1. And then what I realized is that the default ways inside Houdini about how it sort of tetrahedralizes things, because there's built-in tools inside Houdini for tetrahedrons. If anyone's done like FEM solvers, you use tetrahedrons for that because it's a solid thing, it has volume, blah, blah, blah. But I needed to be able to carefully control how it was getting extruded, because if I was doing some strange things, warping it all around, if those tetrahedrons did not sort of line up nicely next to each other, like you can kind of see here in this version they do, then I'd get holes after I sliced it back into 3D. So yeah, I had to come up with a few different ways of like manually in Vex, like put this one here and this one here so I could extrude like a nice polygon shape into 4D. So yeah, this is showing what the results of that is. So I've got my 4D box here, and I do a 4D rotation, which I'll get to in a minute. And this is kind of what it looks like when it's all in 3D. I've got all of these bits connected together everywhere, lots of tetrahedrons, 36. But then when I take a slice to take it back to 3D, then I get something like this. So right now I've got a little control. So instead of just slicing on the W equals 0, I can slice it any W, and I can sort of change that up and down. And yeah, I get this crazy, crazy kind of topology because it's just sort of building this on the fly by slicing all of these tetrahedrons that are sort of all on top of each other like that. So you can see it all moving and the topology changing as I take a different slice. What are these ones here? I can't even remember what this was. Oh yeah, just more complex stuff. I took a grid here, extruded it a little bit, do the same sort of thing, rotate it around, and you can take a slice through that. And that's kind of how it's working. So it doesn't really, I'm not a mathematician. I just sort of poked away at this to try and get it to work. And I'm not trying to sort of create all of these crazy things with math. I was just trying to see, can I put what knowledge I have together in a way that's going to get an interesting visual result, because that's what interests me. So yeah, the rotations. So one of the things that Raphael also told me when he was trying to figure this stuff out is that in 3D, you can think of rotation as an axis and an angle, but really every rotation can be represented by a plane of rotation. So when you think of an axis and angle, it's rotating around that plane that's at the bottom, and it's sort of a rotation is defined by a plane where, as you do the rotation, every point gets stuck to that same, or remains stuck to that same plane. And sort of to illustrate that, I've got this here. Say if I'm rotating this cube along the y-axis, each of those points are stuck to that xz plane. So the same sort of thing happens in 4D. Instead of rotating along the xw or yw or zx plane, you can rotate around the, sorry, what am I saying? Yeah, x, y, z, x, you know, the 3D ones. In 4D, you're rotating around all of these like zw, yw, xw planes. And again, this is the kind of thing that happens as you rotate around those planes, looking at our sort of semi-projected version of it. And then when it sort of takes a slice through it, you get stuff like this. So it was like, okay, once I had this working, I knew that I could start making some interesting things. So rotating things around, getting them to warp and stretch and pop in and out of existence as they travel through that W coordinate. What I also found out is that this makes zero sense to us who have been working in the 3D world, and this is almost impossible to control. And I guess I wasn't deterred because it's like the promise of something interesting coming out of it, but like, oh my God, you can't art direct this stuff. It's really, really hard. Okay. So going back over all of this stuff, I think at this point I had all the ingredients to try and make something nice. So I've got, you know, I'm thinking about dimensionality, I've got lines, I've got surfaces, I've got solids, I've got four-dimensional things, and I wanted to make something that sort of had a play on that, broke it down. Also, yeah, I thought it would be interesting also if I was using the idea of physicality and non-physicality, because four-dimensional stuff is definitely something that doesn't happen in the physical world, and I wanted to contrast that with something physical, like a physics-based animation. So trying to take something that was animated in a physical way and then really deconstruct it through 4 dimensions. And then in that idea of physicality, I was also thinking about, okay, well, what can I use in this? And I was thinking, okay, well, I've got lines, and say maybe that's a neon light. I've got surfaces, maybe that's a cloth, and I've got solids, so maybe that's like solid things, like in a rigid body kind of thing that's falling around. So I think those were the sort of things that I think, okay, let's make something using this set of ingredients. And I guess the other part of that too was that if I'm thinking about rendering, lights, and yeah, I had some volumes and things in there too. That's the rendering side of things. I've got cloth sims, I've got smoke sims, I've got IBD sims. That's a nice wide range of Houdini that I can test on the Mac Silicon build and see what I can find there. So, yes, okay. So now I'm going to sort of just talk through, talk through some of this, like see where my head was at in trying to come up with this. So I might mute it. I forgot to credit the audio was not made by me. That was by Olivier Oran. Yeah, thank you, Olivier. So yeah, this first bit here, I'm thinking, okay, points, lines, surfaces, solids, 4 dimensions coming through there. Okay, cool, interesting. Using, oops, that's annoying. I can't pause. Oh, I can. And then using the idea of a sort of neon light as a line and representing these shapes that are higher dimensional shapes using 1-dimensional lines. Okay, that's interesting. And started to push it further. So I went back to the idea of the tetrahedron and thinking about representing a solid shape with a surface. Well, in my sort of vocabulary, my surface is cloth and my lines are light, so I turned this into a cloth. And then, once I had the simulation, I decided to extrude that into 4 dimensions and rotate it around and try and deconstruct it and get something interesting looking. So that's what's going on here. It's getting sort of stretched and pulled around as it rotates through 4-dimensional space. What I did for that, and I can show some of this a little bit later too. Next door, I've got the scene file over there. But basically taking the result of the simulation and extruding that into 4-dimensional space and rotating it post-sim and slicing it back up again. And that's what's happening here too. Just taking a more basic 3D simulation, extruding it into 4D, rotating it around and slicing it back. Here's where things started to get a little bit more interesting, which is like I was doing this sort of thing. I was like, yeah, that's pretty fun and cool, but people always talk about time being the 4th dimension. It's like, well, it's not a spatial dimension here, but what if I turned it into a spatial dimension? So what I'm doing over here, and I'll load it up and show you, is I ran some sims. So I've got like a block that's falling through a bit of cloth. And I then took the starting frame of it all and extruded it into many, 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 many steps. So it's just like if you're doing a 3D extrusion and you've got lots of edge rings in between it to break it down. I did the same thing, but with my 4D extrusion. So I extruded it over and over and over and over again. And then I could look up into my original animation where it is at different points in time, and then move the positions of all of those steps of the extruded bit along that same path. So in effect, what I generated is a single 4-dimensional shape that represents that whole animation. I can load this bit up here and show you here too. So here's my nice cloth sim, and it's got, I just used, like a little, there we go, spinning block for that, coming through a bullet. So yeah, time shift it back to the start. I use my extrusion thing with lots of steps, and I take that sim with a trail and a time shift, so I've got like a duplicate of where it is at every point in time during that sim, and then I basically copy those positions back over to my extruded 4-dimensional shape. So by the time I get out of it, I have to wait a little bit because it's a little bit slow, especially on this one. But it's generating one big 4-dimensional shape that's made up of lots and lots of tetrahedrons, which I can then, fiddle around with. And because I am, as it extrudes through time, I'm setting that W coordinate as well, so that my axis, my W axis is basically time. So if I slice up and down through that W axis, I'm slicing up and down through time. Let's get over here and I'll show you if it's fast enough. Okay. Where are we? Okay. So yeah, I've turned off all the rotations. So this is just without any modifications. It's just the thing going through time. And as I go, back in time a little bit, I get that, and forward in time a little bit because I'm animating this W value. The only difference is that I'm slicing that big 4-dimensional structure to get there. So when you take a look at the, the topology, you can start to see there's all of this weird stuff going on because it's coming out of the sliced version from there. But then the fun starts when you start adding in these rotations, and then you can start getting some really weird looking things. So, oopsie, pardon me, I need to go back onto that. So what I'm doing in many of these is I'm starting with it kind of similar to how it was originally, and then progressively over time, rotating it through 4 dimensions to sort of deconstruct it and break it up and warp it even more. And the result starts to get almost like a little bit of a slit scan effect, but in 3D. So you can see that some of the areas here are still at an earlier point in time, and some of the areas here, they're sort of being rotated further in time. So things are breaking up, and we're seeing this object at multiple points in time, all sort of connected and warped in together. And I knew when I was starting to get sort of crazy shapes like this, that this was something that was pretty cool. As it rotates down, we've still got parts of it which are still back in time. This is down here, this is turned around here. I don't know what's going on, but it looks really nice. So, oops, pardon me. I'll continue on. So there's that. Okay, now same thing here, but with just an RBD sim. So same sort of concept. I take the animation, I copy the points all back to the positions of it all back to my 4D piece of geometry, and then I get something crazy that's like this. So because of the way that it's rotated, you can even see like towards this bit here, this is rotating back up again, back through time, and this is rotating forward through time, and it's all happening at the same time, and it gets a little out of control. Very hard to control, but managed to just tweak a little bit to find things that look nice. You can kind of see there's a little bit of dodgy shading on there, and that's because of the slicing. This particular one, it got really heavy. It made about 100 million tetrahedrons by the time I'd put it all together, and so I was happy to have a nice fast computer that I'd be able to work this on. And we'll continue through to the last little bit here was where I wanted to sort of put everything together at the end and sort of push things in a crazy way. So I was taking the idea of my one-dimensional lines that I was thinking about as like neon lights, and I turned it into 3-dimensional geometry, and then I sort of simmed that and pushed that through 4-dimensional space. So that starts warping up in a strange way, have them sort of shatter and interact. And then what I was also what I thought would also be fun is if I create a volume that's actually filling the illuminated gas inside and try and figure out where that volume was in time, so that in this bit here, it's still back in time before it's actually smashed and the gas hasn't come out. So this is still illuminated here. But then over here, the gas has come out, so it's empty, and sort of tracking how that all sort of fit together. And this is the final thing here. I did, with what you see here, I did start going a little bit even more crazy, where, I don't know if maybe I can show it. I think I've got time. I took my tetrahedron and I sliced it in a weird, okay, here we go. I can pull it up. It'll be easier if I explain it. Here we go. I took my tetrahedron and then I broke it up and I let that fall down into an IBD sim, and then I put that through 4-dimensional space as well. So really trying to play with the idea of, I've got my 3-dimensional geometry that then gets clipped and sliced into 4 dimensions, and I then turn it back into 3 dimensions, which then have the RVD sim, and then I put that through 4 dimensions as well, so it all warps around. And after I'd gone through that many layers, I realized that was probably a good time to stop because it was getting a little out of hand. And so, yeah, that's what's going on in the background there. Yeah, so that's the end of my experiments. I feel like I could sort of go further, but it wouldn't really be healthy. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed looking at that. I thought it was just really interesting, trying to take things in a different direction. Yeah, so the experience with working on the Mac, I should talk about that too. So probably, yeah, so from an early point, I had a little chat room with Robert, who's probably in this room, I can't see, and one of the other developers, and Fiona, and we were, we were just trying to see, okay, are there any problems that need to get fixed? And when I first started using it, I basically couldn't use Karma. It would just crash 10 seconds into sort of turning it around. And everyone was like, oh, no, it's all fine. We can't figure it out. Luckily, they figured it out after a bit of testing. And I saw in the changelog, it said like fixed an obscure Karma crash. But if that wasn't fixed, this wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much for fixing that. I think whether it's just that particular combination of hardware or not, I would say that finding that made this whole project worthwhile, because anyone else who is going to pick that up and run into that crash is going to have a very hard time. A few other little things were fixed along the way, but for the most part, it was actually a really smooth experience. So you can go next door and see there's a Mac Studio there. That's the M2 version. It's faster than the one that I was using, which was 20 cores. And one thing that was really impressive to me, and I don't want to sound like an Apple commercial, but I was really impressed by just not just about speed, but other factors which are really important to me, like how much heat does it make? I was working on this during summertime in Sydney, which gets really hot. And previously, like I'd been working on other computers that just make the whole room hot. You have to have fans on. It's disgusting. You're all sweaty. You can't work. That little one just purred away using all 20 CPUs, rendering at 100%. You could barely feel the heat coming out of the back of it. I only once heard the fan switch on, and that's when I realized that the bottom air vents were just completely covered in dust, and it was sort of slowing things down. After I cleaned that off, the fan stopped. And yeah, I was curious because I heard everyone talking about like the energy usage, and so I've got like a little smart meter thing which I was using on my phone. And so this is for August, where I was madly trying to render everything overnight before this talk right now. And it's like 2 kilowatts a night. And when you divide that all up, it's about 80 or 90 watts rendering with all 20 CPUs on maximum going full ball. So it's a crazy low amount of energy usage. It's really interesting. Yeah, I did have a problem with my monitor. I think it was waking the machine up. I couldn't put it to sleep. And then I realized that I don't really need to put it to sleep because it uses about the same amount of energy when it's asleep as when it's idle. It's just that low energy. And then, yeah, so I was sort of focused on just trying to get this project done, but it was worthwhile testing to say, okay, well, like, what are the differences in speeds between the different builds and that sort of thing. And I was really, I knew it felt really quick when I was using it, but I was pleasantly surprised. So I did a little test here, which is just running this default configure fireball sim, just using Pyro, but I reduced the voxel size to much smaller. It was like 0.03. And I also tested it on a really powerful Xeon workstation, which had 26 cores and 52 threads. And here are the numbers here. So it was actually, the Mac was actually significantly faster than that Xeon workstation that I tested it against in this situation. It's not a scientific benchmark. It's not going to test everything, but I was really surprised to see that. And yeah, the Mac Silicon version is also a good step up in speed above the the Intel version, which is using the emulation kind of thing. What I've got here is interactive playback. So that was like playing it back in the viewport and letting it run. So that's, I guess, a little bit more like normal use. And then I just hid that, had the geometry spreadsheet only, and then played it back. And that's what these times down here are for the no scene view. Yeah, I think that's really all I've got to talk about. So the scene file is over on that other Mac there. If anyone wants to have a poke around or ask any questions or anything, or if anyone's got some questions now, love to hear it. But thank you.
Questions? Right here, Diogo.
Hey, awesome presentation. I wonder, because the way you change the topology through like the geometry without going through the VGB, and you didn't have any issues with flickering when rendering. How that worked?
I had loads of issues, and if you look carefully, you'll see them. And I tried to fix as many as I could, but it's just impossible to control. So yes, normals were a big problem, especially on the sort of thin surfaces like the cloth, because sometimes I'd get normals pointing in one direction and other direction on the same piece of geo, and because they weren't connected properly together in topology, it'd all be a big mess. One of the things that helped a lot was venerable old polydoctor node, which worked really well in eliminating most of those issues. The other thing, I was going to mention this, so I'll mention it now. The other thing with the changing topology that made things almost impossible was getting velocities out of it. So if anyone's worked with me, I'm a bit of a stickler for having correct motion blur, but it's really difficult to get motion blur out of this. And I tried all different things, like, okay, following along the trajectory and the W coordinate and stuff like that, but none of it worked. And the reason for that is that maybe there's a mathematical way of doing it. I don't know. I'm not smart enough. But when you see here, the motion of this cube has nothing to do with the motion of the sliced version that's underneath. So because we're just seeing that slice in 3D, it doesn't really bear any sort of relationship to what's happening on the 4D thing. So topology is changing all over the place. You can't like do a trail swap or anything to figure out velocities. I just had to say, okay, too bad, no motion blur. I'm not gonna do it. So yeah, no motion blur. But yeah, I guess that's kind of what I said. This was a really interesting experiment, and maybe someone who is more mathematically minded than me would figure this stuff out. But yeah, it's for this. It's not a general production technique.
That was a real nice thing.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Really cool film. I have like a couple questions. So just for clarification, the RBD sim stuff is like you did the RBD sim first and then kind of ran that through the post process of everything.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Cool. Yeah, that looks insane. Sorry. Yeah. Another question I had was kind of like mess sort of with stuff kind of like this, but not at all in the same way, where like I was just playing with like the rolling shutter effect, which is kind of similar. Yeah. I'm curious if you like looked into that at all, or I don't know if Karma has that. I think it might, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it does either. I know you can make lens shaders, and I think you were making some before, but I don't know if you can access time with that. Yeah, if you could, that'd be really fun to play with too. But yeah, I'm not sure if that's supported or not.
Cool. And then the last question I had is just I'm just trying to still wrap my head around everything, and like I'm curious still like why it's necessary for the whole thing to be made of tetrahedrons. Is that for slicing like internal geometry bits, or? Exactly,
yeah. Because when it was, maybe there's another way of doing it, I don't know. But when I was just first sort of testing things and slicing into, do I have an example somewhere? Here, yeah, no, forget it, doesn't matter. when I was slicing polygons, I was just getting lines out of those polygons that I'd sliced.
Right.
So it's going from like 2D down to 1D for each polygon. But if I had a tetrahedron, I could go 4D down to 3D, or rather, it's more like the tetrahedron is a solid, that's 3D. When I take a slice out of that, it's 2D, and then it builds the surface out of 2Ds, just like we do every day with triangles and squares and that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
That's why I had to use tetrahedrons, yeah. I mean, I've seen people do experiments with four-dimensional geometry and stuff online, and it's all very sort of mathematical, but I wanted something that I could sort of play with inside Houdini and sort of take the sort of modeled shapes that I'm used to and was interested in, but just make it 4D rather than do it all out of formulas or something. So.
Cool. Super cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any written or video explanations of this online already that we could like look at after the presentation?
No, but I think this will be put online, this presentation, and maybe I'll write something up about it. That's a good idea.
Yeah, really, really awesome conference. Thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yeah.
Velamore can effects. No. You mentioned before about sort of normals and how that was a bit of an issue with shading. Did you have any thoughts about in the way that the 3D shapes themselves are kind of based upon 4D components, like how that would react in terms of a shading context of like four-dimensional shading? That's your next film for next year, right?
No, it's too much. Stop.
The answer is no. Other questions? Anybody's mind blown?
Fiana's just reminding me that, yeah, the scene file for people who would like to take a look will be over there, and I think it's going to go online as well too. It's going to be distributed. So. That was better than the real applause.
Any final questions? Yeah.
For the shading and rendering, did you just shade it on top of the actual tetrahedron like polygon with like the shifting polys, or did you go through like a BDB remesh or something like that?
Some of it, yes, and some of it I remeshed. So yeah, like that one which I pointed out, which had all of the sort of crappy bumpy bits there, that was just the crappy topology. These I were able to remesh, so that's why it looks a lot smoother there too, like keeping the corners in line. The reason why I couldn't remesh some of the ones like this was that, I don't know what was going on in there, but it was just like, it didn't end up being a continuous surface. So when it was all in like little patches that weren't connected together. And even when I fused it, there'd still be like little holes in between things and things didn't line up. So just gonna have to render it like that. But, yeah, the cloth stuff, sometimes I was able to remesh that. Sometimes I wasn't. So I just, yeah, did the best I could with what I had.
Cool, thanks.
Was it weird to go back to normal 3D, like no 4D? Like, were you grateful for just having 3 dimensions?
I'm still down there, man. No, I mean, I was doing this after my day job too, so I had that grip on reality. But yeah, it's just really difficult to control this stuff, and so sometimes I'd been like fiddling around with those rotations, and I got it at a really cool number, and then I did something wrong, and I couldn't go back to those numbers, and there's no way of intuitively trying to go back to where it was. It was all just like, is it that? No. Is it that? No. Is it that? No. So yeah, I think that's also why it took so long to finish.
Thank you.
All right. Well, awesome. Matt, thanks very much. Oh, one more question. One more question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
I am curious, what were your biggest takeaways from this experiment? I am a beginner user of Houdini, so this is way above me. But I want to know from your perspective, what were your biggest takeaways? And thank you.
I guess whenever I try to do projects like this, like I said at the start, I like to see if I can do something I haven't done before and learn in the process. So I was happy that I did that, found something that was interesting. And I guess the other thing too, whenever I'm doing, whether it be doing sort of dev stuff at work that gets thrown out, or if it's personal work or that sort of thing, anything that you really do in Houdini when you're sort of fiddling around with things and doing little tests, it all sort of stays there in the back of your mind. And it's all stuff that you can sort of reach into the toolbox later on and pull out. And maybe I'm never going to use anything like this ever in real production, but maybe there's a few things like maybe the slicing thing. Maybe I'll come across some effect I need to do at work where I need to sort of slice something, and maybe there'll be interesting things I can take out of it. And I think that's, I guess it's with any software, but Houdini too, if you've got like little things in old files that you can sort of pull out some nodes and rework them and put them in other things, like nothing really ever goes to waste. So, yeah, I'm hoping to, maybe in the future, some of this will be useful.
What's your top tip to new users of Houdini? What's your recommendation?
Go to this guy's website, CG Wicked.
CG Wiki.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. Excellent. Mind-blowing stuff.